And here we go. Okay, so we left our hero hanging at the edge of a cliff, and the locomotive is about to run him over. And will he be saved in the last minute? That's the tension that we have been from last week. Just kidding. So the subject that we're talking about is adjusting the reading of the Megillah when Purim falls out on Shabbat. And we have had an extensive discussion about when the 14th falls out on Shabbat, when the 15th falls out on Shabbat. So right now that's not relevant for us. We dealt with that already, about how do you move things around, and which communities have to move to an earlier date, which communities stay on the same date. And all of these questions that we already dealt with are based on one simple rule that causes us all of these other to make all these other adjustments, and that is that we're not going to read the Megillah on Shabbat. Everybody understands this, and then the question is, so what do we do about it? What do we do instead? But we don't read it on Shabbat itself. So we're going to start again from the last line on 4b4, the left-hand column, where it says the Gemara seeks the reason for this prohibition. Okay, so we read it, but we didn't have enough time to discuss it. So we're going to look at this a little bit more at length today. Who'd like to read for us 4b4, the last line on the left-hand column? The Gemara seeks the reason for the prohibition. Somebody want to volunteer, please?
I'll volunteer.
Wait, Beryl was raising her hand.
Okay, then Beryl.
Either that or I don't know, was it the stuffed bear?
No, that was my hand, not the bear's.
Okay.
Sarita could read if she wants, but it doesn't matter.
No, go ahead. I was just jumping in because nobody else had, so you go ahead.
The Gemara seeks the reason for the prohibition against reading the Megillah on the Sabbath. At any rate, all the Tananim mentioned above agree that we do not read the Megillah on the Sabbath. What is the reason for this restriction? The Gemara answers, Rabbi said, everyone is obligated in the Megillah reading and in the shofar blowing, but not everyone is competent in Megillah reading. Therefore, the rabbis ruled that the Megillah is not read on the Sabbath. As a precautionary decree, lest one take a Megillah in one's hands and go to an expert to learn how to read the Megillah, and thereby carry it 4 amos in a Reshut Harabim.
Or say Reshut
Harabim, a biblical violation.
Just go to the next paragraph too. Go ahead.
Okay. The Gemara notes that this reason applies in other cases as well. And this is the reason why we do not blow the shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls on the Sabbath. And this is the reason why we do not hold the Lulav when Sukkot falls on the Sabbath. The rabbis were concerned lest one carry the shofar or the Lulav 4 amot in a Reshut Harabim and thereby commit a biblical violation.
Okay, so we're taking this all as one big package. The context here is Megillah reading, but the Talmud notes that this same set of concerns applies in a number of other places. So first, we're just going to deal with Megillah reading. Rabbi, a sage who lived around the year, I don't know what, 280, 300 CE, explains that the problem that the reading of the Megillah on Shabbat is foregone. We don't do it on Shabbat because the rabbis decided not to do it. So it's not like in the Megillah itself, it says, don't read me on Shabbat. But the rabbis said, actually, theoretically, we should read the Megillah on Shabbat, but we're not going to do it. Why not? We want to protect the sanctity of the Sabbath. And we're worried that by telling people to observe the holiday of Purim on Shabbat, it'll lead to Sabbath violations. So therefore, what we would like to accomplish by adding more celebrations and more, we had just now a discussion in Pirkei Avot, serving God, right? Which is what the Purim holiday is. We've invented this new wonderful holiday to celebrate God's presence in the world. And yet, if that celebration is done in a way that desecrates the Sabbath, then we have created an impossible contradiction. Then we have betrayed the very raison d'etre of what all of this whole service, this whole system of service of serving God is all about. So what exactly were they worried about? They were worried that since Megillah is something, as Rabbi says, everyone is obligated in Megillah reading, since everybody is involved in this, but not everybody can do it on their own. So what's going to happen is that in people's enthusiasm or in their dedication to actually celebrate Purim by reading the Megillah, they will not think straight, and they'll go, it's so important to read the Megillah, I'm going to go to my neighbor's house because they really know how to do it and I don't. And therefore, I have this Megillah and I'll bring it over to them and ask them to read it for me. Right? Remember, this is part of what we've actually been talking about all through these last 3 pages, is that some people are more competent and some people are less competent at reading Megillah. And that's why we actually adjusted some of the days so that the people who are off in the farms and in the villages can come in on a market day and they don't know how to read Megillah, and they'll be able to then find somebody to read Megillah. So now what we're worried about is the same, in a certain sense, the same kind of by extension, that an individual might, in their enthusiasm to celebrate this mitzvah, it's all a very worthy cause, they will not pay attention to the fact that there's a more serious mitzvah that they have to worry about, and that they'll disregard. And that serious mitzvah is to keep Shabbat. So what they will do, that's a desecration of Shabbat, according to what Rabbi explains, is they will carry an object and transport it across the public domain. Reshut harabim means the realm or the domain of the many. That was David Kanakis was trying to use that word rabim in Pirkei Avot, just a little while ago. The rabim is the public, right? The many, the public domain. So I'm going to have to cross Main Street to get to my neighbor with my Megillah in my hand. On Shabbat, that's not allowed. So we should just understand that in traditional halacha, in traditional Jewish law, carrying stuff from one place to another is forbidden. It's part of the prohibition of doing commerce on Shabbat. So the idea of Amazon, the whole point of Amazon, what's the greatness of Amazon? Greatness of Amazon is that I can get things from one place to another with a minimum of fuss and bother on your part, and that's its key to commercial success. So this is exactly what is precluded when you observe Shabbat. So observing Shabbat is we're stopping Amazon for one whole day. We're not transporting things from one place to another. And of course, to editorialize a little bit, this is an outrageous idea in modern times. Nobody takes this seriously in the non-Orthodox community. In the Orthodox community, they take it seriously. But in the non-Orthodox community, they don't. And in my opinion, one of the things that we need to wake up to during this pandemic time of upheaval is all of the assumptions that we have been making about technology and about creating civilization and modern life. All of those assumptions need to be revisited. And the tradition, the old-time, old-fashioned tradition of Judaism has deeply important lessons to teach us, but that requires us to actually revolutionize our thinking and our living. So,
Can I make a comment?
sure.
So even within the Orthodox community, I mean, there are communities that have an Eruv, right, which allows things to be carried because it extends,
right.
the idea is it extends the boundary of your home.
Right.
So if
So
that's
this is again. So this.
Wait,
So
wait,
this
wait,
is
let me finish. Let me finish. So if that's the sole reason, why we don't blow shofar and we don't on Shabbat and we don't read the Megillah on Shabbat and we don't do the Lulav on Shabbat, then doesn't that take that away in communities that have an eruv? Then why can't you do these things on Shabbat?
good. So this is. I'm sorry I cut you off, but I get the point. It's not the first time this point has been brought up. So this is one of the ongoing questions all the time, everywhere, for everyone. Where do you draw lines, right? And when is a distinction a meaningful distinction, and when is a distinction silly? When are you dancing on the head of a pin, and when are you actually making a really crucial decision? An Eruv works only for non-Reshut Harabim spaces. An Eruv works for spaces that the rabbis added to expand the prohibition of carrying. And then in places where they made the prohibition exist, they then said, and here's a workaround if it's going to cause too much anguish and inconvenience. So an Eruv does not work in Reshut Harabim. An Eruv only works in semi-public spaces that then are the prohibition is created by the rabbis from the official biblical perspective. The prohibition of carrying doesn't apply there. They said, no, we're going to make it apply there, except unless you make an Eruv to remind yourself and to symbolize that this space needs to be owned as a private space and not as a public space. Create this as an Eruv. Now, of course,
there are Eruvs around entire towns. I grew up in Lakewood. There's this huge Eruv.
Correct.
I mean,
so then you get into the minutia of what is a public space and what's not, and you can go both ways. You can say, I'm going to define public space in such a narrow way that nothing that you and I know about is a public space. So, for instance, is Manhattan a public space or not? So I think that intuitively we would all say, yeah, Broadway is a pretty public space. Times Square is a pretty public space. On the other hand, there are ways to define public space in halakha so that you could get around it. So this is, in general, like I say, one of the big issues of applying law everywhere, anywhere in the entire universe and throughout history in any law system. And it applies to the Jewish law system as well. But there are, in the end, theoretically at least, certain cases where the law applies clearly. So in the end, this is I'm gonna get back to a little bit of what the issue that you're bringing up in a different way in a second. But part of what the rabbis were trying to do was to do two things at once: to minister to a community, to make their way of life a livable way of life, and at the same time, to use the words of our previous session, to serve God unconditionally. That's the tension. And to question a particular decision is what the Talmud does all the time. On the other hand, to acknowledge that this is a worthy and sacred challenge and a sacred kind of mission is something that they felt was fundamental to what they were doing. So they start with contradictory things. They're not looking at things in a very simplistic way. They're trying to make distinctions that will work in a way that will honor Shabbat and at the same time allow people to live. But again, there is a baseline called carrying in the public domain, which they honor and preserve and do not abolish, right? And then here we have a very striking example of them saying, because of that worry, and coming back to what Sarita was saying, and that worry is actually a tiny little worry, because in most cases you can get around it. In most cases, if you've got an Eruv, it's not a problem. And if if you don't carry your Megillah to the other person's house, there's no problem. They could have the Megillah read only in the house where a person knows how to read Megillah. There are all kinds of exceptions and workarounds that were possible, and this is where it really is quite radical that the rabbi said, because of this minuscule possibility, a minuscule percentage that this possibility might actually happen, that the real heart of Shabbat will be violated, even if it's only a 1% chance in this case. We're canceling Purim on Shabbat because Shabbat comes first. So all of the things that you're bringing up, Sarita, I think highlight, they know exactly what you're talking about. They know this. And what they have done is they've chosen to make a very extreme statement to remind us that between Shabbat and Megillah reading, which is a mitzvah that they created with great joy and with great courage, Shabbat comes first. Right? Something to make, I think that should give us pause. Geraldine.
What about the fact that we use instruments to drown out Haman's name?
So what about it?
Well, you could be carrying them or even using them in shul. It has to do with.
So that's not what he said. That's not an example. The answer would be, guess what? So this Purim on Shabbos, we won't use those things. They could have possibly said that, but what Rabbi is saying is, we're not talking about things that maybe would be a violation of Shabbat or not. We're talking about something which is a pure violation of Shabbat, but the maybe is maybe we'll do it, right? So he gives you a clear, uncontroversial case in pure law. Carrying in the public domain is a violation of Shabbat. And then he says, because of our worry that might happen, we will protect Shabbat. This is the fence around the law that is at the very beginning of the rabbinic declaration of principles. Somebody else wanted to say something? Yeah, Lynn. And then Beryl.
So you kind of just touched on my question but I find it interesting that this whole discussion assumes that the person that does not know how to read the Megillah has one, and that the person who does know how to read the Megillah doesn't have one.
So that's it. The first assumption is for sure. The second assumption is not so clear. I would say that the first assumption is, and I think it's fascinating. I think that's why it pays to really look at exactly what they're saying. Yes, they're making assumptions that a person has a Megillah, doesn't know how to read it, doesn't know how to use it, really, really wants to do it, right? We're not talking about, we're worried about the sinners who don't want to celebrate Purim, or we worry about the idol worshipers who are, or murderers or something. No. We're talking about really wonderful Jews who really, really want to be part of this. And the worry is that in their enthusiasm, they will have a Megillah, won't know how to use it, and then take it someplace. They may take it to someplace that has a Megillah. But this is my Megillah. This is precious to me, and it should be precious to you. It should be, this is where we have this, recognition that there's a certain amount of engagement that the person wants, even though the education is not there yet. It's worthy, it's laudable, it needs to be taken care of. That's why we have, again, to go back to our first principles that we looked at in Pirkei Avot, Ha'amidu Talmidim Harbe. The agenda of the rabbis in the end was universal education. No, this is not going to be an elite system that only certain people will be able to know how to do this. You have to get a PhD, you have to get rabbinic ordination, or else you can't do any of this. They want people to know all these things, and that's exactly what they're worried about. We're worried about we're going to create a wave of enthusiasm that in the end will not be able to differentiate between what is absolutely holy in a non-negotiable way, and other things that are holy and precious and laudable, but take a secondary step. And their answer is not to demonize. Their answer is, you know what? We're not going to put the stumbling block in front of people. We're not going to create this Purim celebration on a day that may lead people astray. So to editorialize in a way that's very, very pertinent to today, there's this whole, from my perspective, really ugly set of people or institutions. We just had the Supreme Court, a church, challenged that their right to have services was being limited by the government. How dare the government limit our services that we can have? It's an infringement on our religious liberty. We're serving God, and we're offering the people, how to serve God. And what the government was said, and finally, thank God, by a narrow 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court upheld the California decision, was they said, excuse me, this is about saving a life. You're going to be leading people into temptation to violate the worst possible kind of violation that you can imagine, the sanctity of human life. That is non-negotiable. So guess what? We're not going to allow that, church service, that synagogue service, if that's what's at stake, because we know that people will want it. We know that people will get excited. We know that people will be, really embracing this, as in normal circumstances we wish they would. So yeah, we want people to be excited to come to shul. We want people to come and jump up and down and sing at the top of their lungs and embrace each other and dance in the aisles if they're moved to do that. And like Geraldine says, bang instruments and make a joyful noise. We want that, but not if it's going to kill people. So what we're going to do is not call the service. Instead of saying, you know what, we're going to call the service, but just make sure that you don't get carried away, right? Instead, what they said was, because the danger of getting carried away is real, we're not going to do it. That's the analogy that I'm making. And I think that I wish that there was more, conversation about this in out there, in those kinds of terms. I find this, this text to be actually very, very meaningful in many ways, not just that way, but in many ways for making decisions about where we are today. So, so the assumption is, yes, that there's this spread of people having a Megillah who really want to use it and don't quite know how to do it yet, and then are going to make decisions that are going to be unfortunate. Now, here, their decision is not about saving a life, right? Here, they're saving Shabbos, right? They're saying if there's any chance, a minuscule, tiny little chance, that the sanctity of the Shabbat will be violated, we don't want to go there. That's the other corollary that I try to apply in my own imperfect way. I think that saving the sanctity of Shabbat is actually one of the great questions that we are being posed at this time, at this moment in our society's history. I've read a couple of times the poem out loud where a poet says, imagine, talking about quarantine and about lockdowns, imagine it's like the Shabbos that the Jews observe. Of course, the Jews don't observe it, most of the Jews that we know. But they said, but the poet goes, imagine that it's it's like the Sabbath. We don't travel, we don't go running around to stores, we don't do. Imagine that that's what it is, and then embrace it as a sacred time, right? This is a poet that was trying to say, don't think about it only as deprivation or as suffering. Think about it as an opportunity to reconnect with something very sacred that doesn't depend on, on all of the appurtenances of a modern entitled life. So, that's what Shabbat is supposed to be, and I think that Shabbat is, in that essential way, certainly countercultural to the culture that we have grown up in. And now the pandemic is asking us, what of the culture and civilization that we have been building and growing and expanding, what of that culture is really, to use the word that has come up, essential? And what about it is too much or even harmful, or completely dangerous? And that's beginning to become, a discussion that's out there for very, very, very good reason. Technology theoretically is neutral, but what we've seen is that there comes a point where the neutrality is compromised because of the power that it has. I used the Amazon example before, and Facebook and Zoom and Twitter and all that kind of stuff, and the prevalence of that stuff is beginning to start making some people think that, wait a second, it's like remember when HAL, right? Space Odyssey 2001. When HAL takes over, that's the nightmare. So how do you draw the line? How do you actually protect that kind of preciousness? What kind of sacrifices do you have to make for something that's holy? So the rabbis took this very counterintuitive stance, and here I want to go into the rest of the examples that are mentioned here. So there are two other examples that are mentioned here. The two other examples are Lulav and Chauffeur. What's that? Ooh, a chauffeur. Somebody's blowing a chauffeur. Who's that?
Well, I guess I still have my microphone on.
There you go. So there's a tremendous amount of discussion about how Rabbah's statement applies with in the cases of Chauffeur and Lulav, and it's very, very complicated. And I'm not going to do justice to all the complications. I'm going to boil it down to a more simplified presentation. If you're familiar with this, from observing how we celebrate Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot over the years, then perhaps you've noticed that we do not do these essential ceremonies that are definitive for those holidays, shaking a lulav and blowing a shofar on Shabbos. It's going to come up this year. This year, Rosh Hashanah is going to be Shabbat and Sunday. We're not going to blow shofar on Shabbat. We're going to blow shofar on Sunday. So with the Sukkot, it always happens every year because Sukkot is 7 days. So Sukkot always has a Shabbos in it. And we always don't do Lulav on Shabbat. Right? So every year there's a day of Sukkot where we do not fulfill the mitzvah of Lulav and Etrog. And then for Rosh Hashanah, depending on how the calendar falls out, as it does this year, when Rosh Hashanah happens on Shabbat, we don't blow shofar on Shabbat. And the reasoning is this reasoning. The reasoning is that we are foregoing this mitzvah for the sake of protecting Shabbat. And this is, again, it's mind-blowing. I want to acknowledge that it's a very, very weird decision that was made, and it could have gone a different way. So, for instance, we'll go from the easier to the harder one. When it comes to Lulav, right? First thing I want to, there it goes again. There's that shofar blowing. So, first of all, both Lulav and Shofar are not considered creations of the rabbis, right? The Torah is understood to tell us to take a Lulav and an etrog on Shabbat, on Sukkot, and the Torah is understood to tell us to blow Shofar on Rosh Hashanah. So, this is not as easy a case. Those are not as easy cases as Megillah. Megillah was invented by the rabbis. So you could say, okay, the rabbis invented it, and the rabbis then control when it happens and when it doesn't happen. But the rabbis saw themselves as servants of their master, and their master says, take a lulav and an esrog on Sukkot. Their master says, blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah. So here, the stakes are higher. Right? The stakes are that these are mitzvot that come not from the rabbi's own ingenuity, but from God. And nevertheless, the rabbis took it upon themselves to stop that practice of that mitzvah on Shabbat for the sake of Shabbat. So what's the problem? The problem is we could foresee a possible infraction, a possible desecration of Shabbat by somebody who has a lulav and etrog but doesn't know how to do it, or who has a shofar and doesn't know how to blow it, and who's in their sacred enthusiasm to want to serve God. They're going to take their lulav and their etrog, they're going to take their shofar, and they're going to bring it over into the other person's space, and that will be a violation of Shabbat, even though it's all for the sake of doing a beautiful thing. It's all for the sake of doing a mitzvah. It's all for the sake of serving God, and yet it will be a contradiction in terms. That's how the rabbis saw it. So now some people say, what's so complicated? What, a person doesn't know how to pick up a lulav and an etrog? That we actually see in our community. When people come to shul, which is great, they also, they often say, "Well, I don't know. I have no idea how to hold this. How do you, which way does the etrog go, and how do you shake it, and when do you shake it, and so on." When we get into the ceremonial use of the object, which is part of the object, that's part of what it means to take the lulav and the etrog. People get nervous. And they don't feel secure with doing it on their own, and they want somebody to show them. So the rabbi said, we get it. We understand that that's really what some people are going to need, and we're not going to put them in a position where because of their feeling that need, they're going to transgress Shabbat. So that's what they said both for Lulav and Etrog and for Shofar. Now, in each of those cases, there is, well, in Lulav, there are 6 other days, right? In Lulav, there are 6 other days when at least the mitzvah still exists, right? In Megillah, we're not going to read the Megillah on Shabbat, so we pick some other day to read Megillah, right? So the mitzvah doesn't just disappear, right, because of Shabbat. With Rosh Hashanah, it's a little dicier, because Rosh Hashanah is theoretically only one day. Rosh Hashanah should be only one day. But early on, it became a celebration for 2 days. So there also, we finally get this idea that shofar is not going to disappear this year completely, because on Sunday we're going to blow shofar, but not on Shabbat. This becomes an issue, for instance, with some Reform congregations that don't have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. Then they come back to the question, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to completely dispense with blowing shofar when we only have 1 day of Rosh Hashanah, and that's on Shabbat? And my impression is that then they actually blow shofar on Shabbat, because they think it's too important to, in their gestalt, it's impossible to have a Rosh Hashanah without blowing shofar. So that's, again, these are decisions that go in a different direction. But according to the tradition, there will be shofar, but you have to be patient. You have to come on the second day. Now, again, we recognize in our community, the second day is much weaker than the first day in terms of people's attention and attendance. Many more people come on the first day than come on the second day. Of course, this year, it's all going to be up in the air. And what we're going to do exactly hasn't been determined yet, although some shuls have already made their decisions. And we'll see. But in theory, at least, what the rabbis then said was, we're willing to give up shofar blowing on the real Rosh Hashanah. That's the next part that I want to emphasize. The real Rosh Hashanah is the first day. The second day is an extension of Rosh Hashanah, what we call Yoma Arichta, a long extended day. We have extended it into the second day. There's a difference between the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and the 2 days of all other Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is the new month, right? The beginning of a new month. So sometimes we have 2 days of Rosh Chodesh. We're going to have it in the next month, I think. When we have 2 days of any other month of the year as Rosh Chodesh, the first day of Rosh Chodesh is not the real Rosh Chodesh. It's the 30th day of the previous month, which is observed as Rosh Chodesh out of the ancient uncertainty that maybe it isn't 30-day month, maybe it's only a 29-day month, and this is the first day of the new month. So it's observed as a Rosh Chodesh, even though today there is no longer any doubt, it's really the 30th day of the previous month. But the Talmud says we keep it going that way because this is such an ancient custom. We honor the custom of our ancestors. The second day of Rosh Chodesh, the second day of the new month, is actually the first day of the new month. So when you look at a Hebrew calendar, you'll always see that the first day of a 2-day Rosh Chodesh is the 30th of the previous month, and the second day is the first day of the next month. So we're in Nisan Sivan. In Tammuz, we're going to have a Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. Let me double check here for a half a second. So Rosh Chodesh Tammuz will be on June 22nd and June 23rd, Monday and Tuesday. June 22nd, the first day of Rosh Chodesh, is the 30th day of Sivan. And the second day of Rosh Chodesh, Tuesday, the 23rd of June, is actually the first day of the month of Tammuz. So that's the real beginning of the new month. In Rosh Hashanah, it's the opposite. In Rosh Hashanah, the first day of Tishrei is the first day of Rosh Hashanah. And the second day of Rosh Hashanah is the second day of Tishrei. There is no doubt about when the month begins. And nevertheless, the rabbis decided we're not going to blow the shofar that God tells us to blow on Rosh Hashanah. We're not going to blow it on Rosh Hashanah. We're going to blow it on the second day, the day that we created as an additional day. That's when we'll blow the shofar for God. And we won't blow it on the first day because, God forbid, we should blow the shofar and trample on God's Shabbat. So this is something that, again, it's a huge decision that was made that does not follow automatically from how we might make our own calculations. It emphasizes their concern for Shabbat above all. You know, if you want to be a little simplistic about it, Shabbat is in the Ten Commandments. Rosh Hashanah is. Shabbat is the only ritual that is mentioned in the Ten Commandments. Right? The Ten Commandments has a lot of prohibitions about not treating people the wrong way. It's got some prohibitions about not treating God the wrong way. It's got some positive commandments about respecting God and respecting one's parents. So all of that is about these relationships between God and human beings. The only ritual, quote unquote, commandment in the Ten Commandments is Shabbos, is to keep the Shabbos day holy. And what we see here is a very, very, maybe even shocking example of the lengths that the rabbis were willing to go to completely reconfigure, refashion the observance of Judaism to keep the sanctity of the Shabbat, as they understood it, protected. Right? And what they're saying is it's not about, let's make sure everybody lights candles. What they're saying, which is another thing that they were concerned about. But what they're saying is we need to make sure that people don't do unnecessary work, quote unquote, on Shabbat. Shabbat must be a day freed of all of those kinds of activities. And even if a mitzvah might be the pretext for doing an activity that Shabbat doesn't warrant, then we're going to forego that mitzvah. Lynn, yeah.
Sorry, dealing with a child off screen. Sorry, Rabbi.
That's my sympathies. Okay, that's it. Okay.
So
does it? Yeah, Beryl.
So how does this relate to carrying the Torah around on Shabbat? And why did my last shul have an Erev in the shul?
I don't know why I'm not sure what happened in your oldest shul. Let me start from there. There is more than one kind of Erev. So I don't know exactly what you mean when you said they had an Erev in their shul.
Well, I learned of it one day. It was one of those weird days where you read from more than one Torah, and the rabbi was reading from the Torah, and he got to a point in two Torahs at two different times where he rolled it up really fast and set it aside. So I assumed something was puzzle, because at a certain point, he asked Wolf, we were in the downstairs chapel, he asked Wolf to go upstairs because we had 13 Torahs and there were only 4 downstairs, to get a particular Torah and bring it downstairs, which I assume was because he didn't have anything to read from that, or he didn't have enough Torahs to read from 2, and none of the puzzle.
All right. But what does that have to do with an Erev?
Well, he mentioned it when he asked Wolf to carry a Torah from the other floor.
So I don't know what he was talking about, and I don't want to pretend I know anything about that. In the building itself, there's no problem of carrying the Torah from the sanctuary, around the sanctuary, into the social hall, into the gallery. I'm using Shomrei's setup downstairs, into the yak, or anywhere else. That's not a Shabbat prohibition. The Shabbat prohibition, again, biblically speaking, is to transfer an object from one domain to another, or to transfer an object within the public domain from one part of the public domain to another. More than, guess what? The magic number, 6 feet. 4 cubits is 6 feet. So the whole idea of the distancing of 6 feet is already, understood very well over here. So I have no idea what that issue was about in terms of an Eruv. You don't need an Eruv in the shul building to carry around the Torah. It's not about that. Okay, so let's get back then to our Gemara, and we're going to continue with the last paragraph on 4b4.
So that's
The Gemara,
the Gemara gives another reason why the Megillah is not read on Sabbath. Rav Yosef said, because poor people anxiously await the Megillah reading in anticipation of receiving the gifts that are normally allocated when the Megillah is read. Since these gifts cannot be allocated on the Sabbath, the rabbis shifted the Megillah reading from the Sabbath to another day of the week.
Okay, so we're going to stop here for a second. Perfect spacing here for the printer to end the page at this note. So now we have, we're returning to Megillah itself. So that means we should take, that's why you have parentheses when we talk about shofar, and the whole note about that this applies to shofar and lulav is a kind of parenthetical remark, and we put that off to the side. And now we have another opinion between that about why Megillah is not read on Shabbat. We have Rabbi offering one opinion. That's the one that we've been talking about until now. And we have Rav Yosef, who says a different opinion. Rabbi and Rav Yosef were always arguing with each other. There's a whole, they were friends, they were colleagues, but they were also very different. The Talmud tells us that Rav Yosef was called Sinai. He was called Mount Sinai because he was considered a person who knew everything. He was like an encyclopedia, a walking encyclopedia of the Torah. He knew everything in the Torah. Rabbah was called Oker Harim. He was called the person who uproots the mountain. So the mountain is Mount Sinai. That's Rav Yosef. And Rabbah was considered the person who was so sharp in his reasoning, so acute in his powers of analysis that he could, he was coming at things. He may not have known every single footnote. He may not have known every single possible precedent or citation. That was Rav Yosef's forte, but he could analyze like nobody else. So these were two sages. As I said, they lived around the end of the 3rd century CE, and they are, recorded in a number of places as disagreeing with each other. And the Talmud tells us that, a couple of things. This was in Pumbedita, which was an academy in Babylonia, and the position of head of the academy opened up, and the question was, who should get it? Should Rabbah get it, or should Rav Yosef get it? So they sent a letter to the land of Israel, to the sages there, and they said, what should we do? Who has priority? Should it be Sinai or Oker Harim? Should it be the one who knows every tradition and every fact and every law, or should it be the one whose powers of argument and analysis are better? They sent back a note that Sinai should get the position, the person who has more accumulated knowledge. But Rav Yosef, that's Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef refused. Rav Yosef refused the position, and he said, as long as Rabbi is around, Rabbi should get the position. And Rabbi was then appointed, and they say about Rav Yosef that Rabbi was the head of the academy for something like 22 years, something like that. All during that time, Rav Yosef went out of his way not to put himself in the limelight. So he would not, show himself to be a man of distinction. So the example that they give is that he wouldn't have the doctor come visit him. He would go visit the doctor. If he was sick, he wouldn't say, hey, I'm Rav Yosef, so come and visit me and I'm sick. He would humble himself and not treat himself as somebody of distinction. When Rabbi died, Rav Yosef actually then succeeded him, and he was the head of the yeshiva for another 2.5 years, and then he passed away. One of the other things about Rav Yosef is that he actually went blind, and he had to be helped by Abaye, who was one of the greatest sages in the next generation. He was his student. So Rav Yosef was a great man, and he was a humble man who also was, a person of as I say, encyclopedic knowledge, but not necessarily somebody who's going to come up with the latest creative argument about how to do something. Here we have Rabbi and Rav Yosef not agreeing. They agree on the law, but they don't agree on the reason for the law. They agree that the law is that we don't read the Megillah on Shabbos. But the way that they look at things is in two different ways. So Rabbi says we're worried about preventing Sabbath desecration. Even if it's the most minuscule possibility, we're going to step up and we're not going to let that happen. Rav Yosef says, no, what we're worried is that we're worried about poor people. We're worried about the people who depend on the celebration of Purim to give them an extra package of food for their family, or an extra donation that they might get. So he says, if we had Purim happen on Shabbos, there would be a huge letdown among the poor people, because the poor people would see everybody celebrating Purim, and yet they would be excluded from that celebration because they wouldn't be able to get their gifts and their money on Shabbos. So he says it's for their sake that we're actually putting off the celebration of Purim. And they would expect to get these things, and they would be sorely disappointed. So we have a very, very different explanation, very, very different set of concerns. Also, we should just understand his explanation is local. It applies only to Megillah. It doesn't apply to Chauffeur or to Lulav, where the law is also the same. In the end, Rabbi's explanation is the consensus explanation. But that doesn't mean that Rav Yosef is rejected. Take a look at footnote 30, please.
Rav Yosef clearly does not dispute the reason presented by Rabbi, for in cases of Shofar and Lulav, no other reason is evident. Rather, Rabbi Yosef gives an additional reason which is more inclusive than Rabbi's. Unlike Rabbi's version, which does not apply in the temple, where more precautionary measures generally apply, Rav Yosef's reason applies in all locales.
Okay, so that's the difference. A set of concerns that applies to Megillah per se, and that applies in our time, and everywhere and at all times. Okay. So now we're going on to the next page. Still 4B, 4B5.
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 The Gemara adduces a baraita in support of Rav Yosef's assertion that poor people anxiously await the Megillah reading in anticipation of receiving gifts. This was also taught in a baraita. Even though the rabbis said that villagers may advance their reading to the day of assembly, they must collect gifts for the poor on that day, i.e., the day of assembly, and distribute them to the poor on that day.
Okay, so here we have a teaching that tells us that this is coordinated, right? That the observance of Purim is not split up. There are different mitzvot. There's the reading of the Megillah, there's having the meal, there's having the allocation of tzedakah to the poor people, there's giving gifts of food to one's friends, and so on. So all of those things, says this Braita, they are coordinated. If we push the reading of the Megillah off to another day, then all of the other things are pushed to that day, and that's the signal for all the poor people. When they see that people are reading Megillah, then they know, oh, good, we're going to get our assistance, our aid package today. Again, just to emphasize this, what we have here is a real sensitivity to the anguish of the needy. This is a psychological anguish. We can say, all right, they'll get the package the next day. They'll get the package some other time. We'll make sure that the check is in the mail. But this is recognizing the anxiety of the people that needs to be ameliorated right now. There needs to be a system where they know when to expect their help to arrive. I mean, we know that the people that their check is delayed in the mail, it becomes a real source of pain and unhappiness and anxiety for people. I just saw this ridiculous report that there's only one ATM in all of Manhattan that allocates unemployment benefits, government unemployment checks through some bank's debit card. In other words, people get the debit card from the government, but if you go to other banks, you'll lose a processing fee. If you get it from the bank that has the debit card, so you won't lose the processing fee. And there's only one ATM from this bank, which is out in Kansas someplace, in all of Manhattan. So people actually wait hours, they travel for hours, and they wait hours and hours. And this is an affliction. This is saying, okay, we'll help you, but you'll have to go through hoops. People that have talked about applying for unemployment and so on, and how long it takes and so on. When you don't have it, every minute is painful. So this is the Gemara acknowledging that in this particular kind of setup, we want to make sure that the poor know exactly when they're going to get what they are hoping for. Okay. The Gemara notes a difficulty.
The Gemara notes a difficulty with the language of this baraita. How can the baraita say, even though the rabbis said, this expression implies that the fact that villagers read the Megillah on the day of assembly is a reason for not allocating gifts to the poor on that day. But to the contrary, it is only because the rabbis said
It's only because the rabbis give a little extra oomph. It's not even though the rabbis, it's actually because the rabbis.
It is only because the
Yeah.
rabbi said that the villagers read the Megillah on the day of assembly do they allocate gifts to the poor on that day.
Right. So that it's the whole point is, since they instituted to read the Megillah on that day, therefore the gift should be on that day. So why does the text say even though they decided to read the Megillah on a different day, the gifts go on that day? It should be not even though. It says precisely because. So what does the Gemara do?
The Gemara amends the language of the Baraita. Rather, this is how the Baraita should read. Since the rabbis said that the villagers may advance their reading to the day of assembly, they should collect gifts for the poor on that day, the day of assembly, and distribute them to the poor on that day, because poor people are anxiously await the Megillah reading.
What till that? Okay.
It-
So there was a little some staticky noise in there, but hopefully, if you have the text in front of you, the main point is that they take out the phrase af al pi. They take out that phrase even though they said that the village should advance their reading to the day of assembly. Instead, it's ho'il, since they said. So we have here an emendation of an earlier tradition, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Okay, this is also a little eyebrow raising. Usually, they try to keep their the text as pristine as possible, and here they're simply saying it cannot be that way. It's got to be changed. The recollection of the tradition has been formulated the wrong way. The connection between reading the Megillah and giving the gifts is not in contrast, but it actually follows one from the other, and therefore we have to put it in as since. I think it would have been easy, nevertheless, to actually defend that original phrase. I think that what we could have said is, what they mean is, even though this is not the real day of Purim, nevertheless, we're going to treat it as the real day of Purim in all its respects. Right? Even though we're reading on the 12th, let's say, instead of on the 14th, nevertheless, we want to make sure that everybody gets the gifts and so on and so forth on the 12th, and we shouldn't insist, no, it should be on the 14th. That's when we should give the gifts. Or we've got an extension. We can do it on the 14th. That's the real, best day. So we've got a couple of days. No, even though it's not exactly the right day, nevertheless, we have to treat it as if it is the right day. Now, then the next point is, why? Since we said that everything has to be put in one place, since the eyes of the poor are to the people who have the wherewithal and who are celebrating Purim on this day, we don't want to take away from their expectations. Okay. Any comments or anything? No. We're moving right along. Good.
Having stated that when the
Get ready to get your page 5. I sent it out to as many people as I could. If anybody doesn't have it, then right now, in another 4 lines, we're going into page 5A1. So get it ready or go to Safaria. And if you didn't get it, please tell me or send me a note and I'll send it to you. And also, while I'm remembering, next week we're not studying because we have a special program, the virtual tour of Jewish Amsterdam. Okay, good. Now, here we go. Having stated
that when the Megillah reading is advanced to an earlier date, The allocation of gifts to the poor is also advanced. The Baraita now points out that this does not apply to the other laws of Purim.
Ah,
The obligation of rejoicing, i.e. the Purim feast, applies only in its regular time, the 14th of Adar.
okay. So now we say that what? Oh, the meal, that's different. The meal you should have on the 14th of Adar. So let's read footnote number 1.
The same principle applies when Purim falls on the Sabbath. Although the Megillah reading is advanced to Thursday or Friday, see Mishnah 2a, the Purim feast is held on the Sabbath. Rashba and Ritva to Mishnah below.
Okay. Keep
Mishnah.
going.
The Yerushalmi, however, derives from scripture that the Purim feast is not held on the Sabbath. Instead, it is postponed until Sunday.
And this is the view adopted, etc., etc., etc. So what we have here is an example of not a frequently occurring example, where the view of our Talmud is not adopted, and the view of the Jerusalem Talmud or the Palestinian Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi, is adopted. According to what we've just read, the celebration through a feast, the Su'udah, the festive meal that you're obligated to have on the day of Purim, should apply always on the right day. So if you're in the unwalled cities, it's on the 14th. If it's the walled cities, it's on the 15th. What about Shabbat? We just had this whole extensive discussion about the fact that we're putting off the reading of Megillah on Shabbat because it could lead possibly to violation of Shabbat. So what about the feast? What about the meal itself? So the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, that's the one we're reading right here, says, no, there's no reason to worry about that. Everybody has feasts on Shabbat. That's part of what it means to observe Shabbat. So people have a beautiful Shabbat meal all the time. So that it's going to count as a Shabbat meal and it's going to count as a Purim meal, no problem. So let's keep it on the right day. That's the insistence of the Babylonian Talmud. But as the footnote points out, that's not the position of the Talmud of the land of Israel. The Talmud of the land of Israel, they apply this rule across the board. If we don't read Megillah on Shabbat, then we don't do anything else on Shabbat. The feast does not get detached from reading Megillah. The feast is also put into a different place. However, it gets detached from reading Megillah because Megillah reading will be earlier and the feast will be later. Right? We don't postpone the reading to Sunday. The reading will go to an earlier day. But we postpone the feast to the next day. Why would that be the case? Why should we take the feast and not put it earlier and instead put it later? Why shouldn't we say, well, if we're going to read Megillah on Thursday, so let's, take care of everything all in one shot. We're not going to be able to have the feast on Shabbat, so have it earlier, either Friday or Thursday. Why are we putting the feast? The reading will be Friday or Thursday. The feast will be on Sunday. Sarita.
So I can see not having the feast be the same because then, in effect, you're dwarfing. Your people won't be aware that it's the feasting for Purim, right? Because it just gets overshadowed by Shabbat. So I can see wanting the feast not to be on Shabbat,
Okay.
be on a separate day. I am confused about why, if the Megillah reading is advanced, the feast would be later. It strikes me that Purim then becomes this sort of fractured kind of holiday. And I mean, I see that with us as well. I mean, we have the Megillah reading, of course, whatever day it falls on. Our Shalach Manot, our community Shalach Manot, is typically distributed on the same day as the carnival, which is, because it's on a weekend, is not the same day as when we do Megillah. So you end up with this holiday that's sort of doesn't seem unified in some way.
So I think that there's, I think you're right. I think that though the considerations are a little bit different. The Shomrei considerations are purely logistical, right? They're purely saying, when are we going to be able to get people? We live in a non-Jewish society. We're not going to be able to take off the whole day of Purim to do this. Sunday is a day off in our society. We take advantage of Sunday. So, that's our practical consideration. The Shalach Manot, like you say, totally a practical consideration. When are we going to be able to get these baskets distributed to people? In a traditional community, effort is made on the day of Purim to get those food baskets delivered. So that happens only on the day of Purim. Our compromise doesn't happen in very traditional communities. But that's a practical consideration. Here, I think that, clearly there is some kind of attention to practicality when we talked about whether it should be on the market day, that's better, and so on, and so on and so forth. But, and I think your point is good about take it out of Shabbat, then it really loses its distinctiveness. I think that what you have here is not so much a practical compromise, as I think that you have here an expansion of Purim. Remember, Purim is a one-day holiday. One-day holidays in the Jewish tradition are not, the ones that end up, getting a lot of play. When we have, Pesach and Sukkot that are 7 days or 8 days, then we have there's a certain stature to it that Shavuot never had. Right? Shavuot gets lost because it's just this one-day holiday. I think that what we have here is a little bit of an attempt to create a carnival where the celebration ends up extending for more than 1 day. Right? So we have this kind of weird multi-day thing, but those multi-day things are exclusive. If you're on the 14th, you're not on the 15th. If you're on the 15th, you're not on the 14th. But now, what this gives us a chance to do is we can read Megillah, we give gifts to each other, and then we have Shabbos, and we've got basically a Memorial Day weekend. We've got a long, a 4-day weekend. It's great. We get this whole extension. I think that that's part of what's going on here. I mean, it's not discussed here in that way, but this, in the end, is the way that it works out. Okay, so Yesha Koach, I hope that we'll be able to get together in 2 Sundays. Okay, thank you to everyone. Yesha
Thank
Thank you. Have a good week. Shavua Tov.
Tov.
Shavuot Tov.